Don't be afraid. I'm here.
The quiet nurse whispered. Then she stepped in front of the bullet. The gunman had aimed at Claire Halstead, sister of a Navy SEAL admiral, the only witness to a defense corruption deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He never expected the woman in the oversized scrubs to move faster than his trigger finger. The bullet tore through Mara Ellison's shoulder. She didn't fall. She used her own blood to mark the shooter's escape route on the floor, then ordered a full hospital lockdown like someone who had done it before. Because she had. The hospital staff knew her as the timid nurse no one noticed. The assassin knew her by a different name entirely Raven, and that meant someone had sent him here specifically for her. If you want to find out what Raven does next, and who sent that gunman, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the rest of this story. Now let's go back to the beginning. 3 months into her new life at Tidewater Naval Medical Center, Mara Ellison had learned one thing above all others. The easiest way to disappear was not to run, but to shrink. She wore scrubs, a full size too large, pulled her dark hair into the plainest knot she could manage, and kept her eyes down whenever anyone passed her in the hallway. She never arrived late, and never left early, never took credit when something went right, and never argued when someone blamed her when it went wrong. In the way that matters most in a busy hospital, Mara had become invisible, and that was exactly the point. The staff at Tidewater saw what she wanted them to see, a quiet, unconfident nurse who seemed slightly out of her depth in a high-pressure environment. Dr. Roland Pierce, Chief of Surgical Services, had no patience for what he perceived as mediocrity. He was the kind of man who mistook volume for authority, whose certainty about his own brilliance left no room for the possibility that he might be wrong about anything, including people. That morning, when the patient records system glitched and 3 charts became temporarily inaccessible, Pierce called Mara out in front of the entire resident team. He used the word careless. He used the phrase, patients could die. He looked at her with the particular contempt that powerful men reserve for people they have already decided don't matter. Mara stood at the nursing station, with both hands flat on the counter, and said nothing. To everyone watching, she looked like a woman swallowing humiliation because she had no other choice. What they couldn't see was the deliberate stillness. She was maintaining the conscious, practiced effort to keep every trained instinct locked behind a face that gave nothing away. The system glitch had nothing to do with her. She had already identified the source of the error and quietly corrected it 12 minutes before Pierce started speaking. She would not be telling him that. Cole Rourke noticed her from across the hallway. He was the head of hospital security, a former Marine compact and unhurried in the way that people who have survived genuinely dangerous situations often are. He had been in the middle of a disagreement with one of his junior officers about access control for the surgical ward, a conversation he took seriously not because he needed to be right, but because he had seen firsthand what a single unsecured entry point could cost. He was explaining patiently, but without softening it, that a protocol only protects people when it's followed every single time, and then he stopped. Because across the corridor, the nurse Pierce was dressing down had not flinched, had not looked at the floor, and had not shifted her weight even slightly. She was scanning the hallway behind Pierce's shoulder with the kind of eyes that counted exits without being obvious about it. Cole recognized that habit immediately. It was the same one he couldn't turn off himself. He filed it away and said nothing. Talia Brooks, who shared most of Mara's shifts and had decided early on that Mara was going to be her friend, whether Mara wanted one or not, handed her a coffee after Pierce walked away. Talia was perceptive in the way that people are when they pay more attention to what isn't being said than to what is, and she had long since accepted that Mara would never fully explain herself. What she couldn't let go of was the quality of Mara's calm. It was the wrong kind for shyness. People who were timid looked uncomfortable in their own skin. Mara looked like someone who had made a very specific decision about how much space to occupy. Those were different things entirely, and Talia had been turning that distinction over for weeks. She handed over the coffee and stood beside her in silence, which was its own kind of message. The morning moved the way mornings at Tidewater usually did, controlled chaos, held together by routine. Mara changed dressings, administered medications, updated charts, and spoke to patients in the low, even voice she used for everything. She was good at this work. She had always been good at the mechanics of keeping people alive, even when the circumstances looked nothing like a hospital corridor. But she did not think about that. She had spent 3 months making sure she didn't. It was in the pediatric ward that her guard slipped just slightly. Owen Parker was 8 years old, had a hairline fracture in his left wrist from a fall at the playground, and was frightened in the specific way children become when they find themselves somewhere unfamiliar without the people they trust most. His mother had stepped out to speak with the attending, and Owen sat on the edge of the examination table staring at the door, like something bad was about to come through it. Mara came in to check his dressing and found him like that. She didn't offer false cheer or speak over his fear. She pulled up a stool, sat down until she was level with his eyes, and told him that being brave didn't mean not being scared. It meant doing the next necessary thing, even when the fear was right there beside you. That was all bravery ever was. Owen studied her face for a long moment, and then asked if she ever got scared. She told him yes, more than he knew. It was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in 3 months, and she felt it settle somewhere she usually kept locked. The call came in just after 1 in the afternoon. A Navy escort convoy had been ambushed on the route from the base, and the vehicle carrying Claire Halstead had taken fire. She was alive, a graze wound to the abdomen, significant glass lacerations across her arms and one side of her face, but she was conscious and frightened in a way that had nothing to do with the pain. Claire was the younger sister of Admiral Grant Halstead, a man who had commanded a SEAL unit before moving into senior naval leadership, and the attack on his sister's convoy was not the kind of event that happened without a specific purpose behind it. Cole received the notification before the ambulance arrived and had his team positioned around the emergency bay before the doors opened. Pierce took charge of the clinical side the moment Claire was brought in, ordering imaging and blood work with the efficiency that was whatever else could be said about him genuinely his to claim. Claire kept trying to speak through the assessment. She said the men who stopped the convoy hadn't asked for anything. No demands, no questions. They had come to kill her. She had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and now someone wanted to make sure she couldn't tell anyone about it. Mara heard all of this from across the bay. She heard it, and then she shifted her attention to a man she had been watching for 30 seconds. He wore the jacket of a hospital technician and was moving in the direction opposite to everyone else in the room, away from the emergency toward the perimeter. He wasn't looking at the patient. He was reading camera angles, exit positions, and the spacing of Cole's security team. His right hand was tucked inside his jacket at the hip. Mara set down what she was holding. She crossed the room without hurrying, keeping her body angled to stay outside the man's sightline. She reached Claire's bedside and took the woman's hand before Claire could react to her presence. When Claire looked up, frightened, overwhelmed, uncertain, Mara leaned close and said the only thing that mattered. "Don't be afraid. I'm here." She registered the man turning before the weapon came up. She moved without deciding to turn her body and put herself between the barrel and Claire, and the bullet passed through her left shoulder and drove both of them to the floor. The sound was barely louder than a palm striking a countertop. The effect was not subtle. Cole's team surged forward. The shooter was already cutting through the side corridor toward the service hallway. Mara didn't lose consciousness. There was a long, nauseating second where her vision narrowed and her entire left side seemed to go sideways, but she didn't go under. She kept one hand on Claire and pressed 2 fingers against the wound in her shoulder, then transferred the blood deliberately onto the floor tiles in a directional mark pointing the way the shooter had run. She found Talia beside her with wide eyes and told her to apply pressure and hold it. Then she turned to Cole and told him the shooter was heading for the service corridor and knew exactly where the cameras had gaps in coverage. Cole looked at the mark on the floor. He looked at the way she was holding herself, despite the blood soaking through her shoulder. He didn't speak, but something changed in his expression. A small recalibration, and he relayed the information to his team without asking her how she knew. Pierce arrived and told her she needed surgery immediately. Mara told him she wasn't leaving there until the hallway was confirmed clear. Pierce told her she was being irrational. Mara looked at him with the same stillness she had used that morning when he called her careless, and Pierce did not try a third time. Then the radio crackled. One of Cole's officers reported a man at the front desk with federal identification requesting that Claire Halstead be transferred immediately to a secure location outside the facility. Mara listened from across the room. She watched the man standing at the front desk without appearing to watch him at all. The credentials were convincing. The posture was not. He stood with his weight distributed for movement, not for waiting. His right hand rested at the same position the shooters had. His eyes were reading the room, not the person in front of him. She reached for the internal radio on the wall beside the nursing station. She didn't think about what she was about to say. She said it the way she had said it before, in places where hesitation had a body count attached to it. Raven requesting full facility lockdown, all exits sealed, all non-essential personnel to secure positions, now. The order went through on a frequency the hospital's system wasn't supposed to recognize. It went through anyway because Cole had quietly tied his team's protocols into military-grade channels when he first set up the department, and had never explained his reasons to administration. His team responded before anyone at the administrative level had time to object. Cole heard the call sign. He went still for a moment, in the way that people do when something clicks into place that they weren't entirely expecting. He had read a classified brief years ago about a combat medic attached to a SEAL unit who had kept an entire squad alive under sustained direct fire and then disappeared completely from the military record. The call sign in that brief was Raven. He walked across the room toward Mara, past Pierce, past the staff scrambling to follow lockdown procedure, and stopped in front of her. He didn't ask her to confirm it. He looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. Outside, the lockdown alarms were beginning to sound, and the man at the front desk was backing towards the exit, and one of Cole's officers was stepping into his path. And the situation was about to get louder and faster, and more dangerous than anything the morning had prepared for. Mara unclipped her hospital ID from her scrub jacket and set it on the counter. She had come to disappear into something small enough that the past couldn't find her. Standing there with blood on her shoulder and her cover burned, and a building full of patients who had no idea what was happening around them, she understood that disappearing was finished. It had possibly stopped being an option the moment she walked through the front doors. She just hadn't known it then. "Tell me where your team is positioned," she said to Cole. "All of them. And tell me what you need." The lockdown transformed Tidewater in under 4 minutes. Elevator service cut out. Fire doors sealed themselves in sequence down every corridor. The overhead lighting in the non-essential wings dropped to emergency level, turning the hallways a dim institutional yellow that made everything feel smaller and more dangerous than it actually was. Most of the staff had never been through a real lockdown. They had done the drills, had sat through the briefings, but nothing in a briefing communicated the specific quality of silence that followed the alarms going quiet, and the realization settling in that no one was leaving until this was over. Cole's team moved fast. The man who had presented false federal credentials at the front desk had been intercepted by Cole's officer before the lockdown sealed. He was in restraints in the security office, his cover identity already being run against a naval criminal database. That left 2 confirmed threats still inside the building. One had entered earlier in the day using the uniform and access badge of a maintenance technician. The real technician had been found locked in a supply closet on the 3rd floor, shaken but unharmed. The 3rd attacker remained unaccounted for, possibly embedded somewhere in the staff rotation, and that uncertainty was the most dangerous element of everything Cole was working with. Mara stood at the security station with her left arm bound tight against her side, Talia's field dressing already soaking through at the shoulder seam, and laid out what she believed they were looking at. The attack wasn't designed to succeed through force. It was designed to create pressure enough disruption to the building's systems that the medical staff would have no choice but to initiate patient evacuation, and the moment Claire Halstead appeared in an open corridor, she would be exposed. Whoever planned this had done it carefully. They knew the hospital's layout. They knew where the camera blind spots were, where the backup power switches were located, and they had known before today that Mara would be here. Cole absorbed this without commentary. He had already come to the same general conclusion, but hearing her map it with that precision told him everything he still needed to know about who she actually was. Before he moved his team to the next position, he crossed to Claire's room. He was inside for less than a minute. When he came back out, his expression was unchanged, but Mara noticed him adjust his jacket cuff in the way a person does after placing something small and deliberate, and she understood, without asking, that he had just given Claire something to hold on to. It was Meredith Vale, who arrived at the station 3 minutes later and attempted to shut the whole thing down. Meredith was Tidewater's deputy director, a woman who had built her career on institutional process and who experienced any deviation from established procedure as a personal attack. She was not corrupt. She was something that could be equally dangerous in the wrong circumstances, a person who feared liability more than she feared harm. She told Mara with measured administrative authority that a wounded nurse did not have the standing to issue security commands over the hospital's internal systems, that the use of an unrecognized military call sign on hospital frequencies created significant legal exposure for the facility, and that Mara had directly contravened Dr. Pierce's medical directive by refusing to report for surgery. She also mentioned in a tone that was meant to be businesslike, but landed closer to threatening that a federal response team was 40 minutes out, and that she was inclined to transfer site authority to them upon arrival. Cole stepped between them. He didn't raise his voice. He said flatly that Claire Halstead was alive because Mara had put herself in front of a bullet before anyone else in the room had even processed what they were seeing, and that if Meredith wanted to have the procedural argument, she was welcome to schedule it for after the building was secure. Meredith's expression tightened, but she didn't push further. She withdrew, though not far, and Mara understood that the federal team arriving on Meredith's invitation was a clock that was now running. The thing about the shoulder wound was that it had stopped being sharp and started being heavy. A deep bone-deep ache that radiated down through her elbow and was beginning to make her fingers unreliable. Mara was cataloging this the way she cataloged everything factually and without sentiment, because sentiment didn't change what the nerve damage was doing. She could still use the arm, carefully and for a limited time. Then Talia came through on the radio, and the calculation changed. Owen Parker and his mother were still in the pediatric common room on the fourth floor. The lockdown had sealed the ward corridors before they could be moved to a centralized safe zone, and the fourth floor sat directly above the Eastern Service stairwell, which was one of the two routes Cole's analysis had flagged as the most likely path for the remaining attackers to use. Mara told Cole she was going up. He told her she had a through-and-through gunshot wound and had already lost enough blood that she had no business climbing 4 flights of stairs. She told him she had promised Owen that being brave only meant doing the next right thing, and if she didn't go, that promise meant nothing, and she meant it to mean something. Cole looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she couldn't entirely read, then assigned one of his officers to go with her and told them both to stay off the main corridor. The eastern stairwell was cold and smelled of concrete and industrial cleaner, and Mara went up it with her left arm pressed against her ribs and her attention on every landing above her. The officer, a former Army reservist named Davis, who moved quietly and followed her lead without being told to stayed 2 steps behind. On the second landing, Mara's right hand caught the edge of the doorframe. When a pressure sensor triggered the door to slam, the metal lip opened a cut across her palm, and she kept moving without stopping, wrapping her hand against her side and leaving it for later. The fourth floor was dim and still when they came through the fire door. The common room was at the far end of the hall. Owen was crouched under the craft table, with his mother's arm around him, and when Mara came through the door, he looked at the blood-soaked bandage on her shoulder, and his face did something terrible with the effort of not crying. She crossed the room and crouched in front of him, slow and deliberate, and kept her voice exactly the way it had been that morning, when none of this was happening yet. "Don't be scared," she said. "I'm here. We're going to walk out together." He took her right hand, the one that still worked properly, and she could feel how hard he was gripping it. They moved into the hallway. Davis took point. They were 30 feet from the stairwell door when a figure stepped out from the alcove beside the supply room and leveled a weapon at Mara's chest, and in the same motion reached out and took hold of Owen's collar. The boy made a sound that Mara would not let herself think about. She went still. Davis went still behind her. The man looked at her with the flat recognition of someone completing a task rather than encountering a surprise. "Raven," he said. "Not a question. They told me you'd be harder to put down than the primary target." Mara heard everything that sentence contained. This was not improvisation. Someone had built a contingency around her specifically, had factored her presence here into the operation from the beginning. She kept her eyes on the man's grip, his trigger hand, his position relative to Owen, and let her left arm drop slightly, letting the way the shoulder was trembling read as weakness because it was half true and she needed the other half to matter. The moment his attention shifted 1 degree toward Davis, she moved. She went left and low, dry into the weapon arm with her right shoulder instead of her injured one, and the shot went into the ceiling. Owen's mother screamed. Owen ran. Davis fired once from behind her, and the man went down, and Mara was already on the floor, with her left arm completely useless, and her shoulder screaming in a way that was going to demand serious reckoning shortly. But Owen was at the end of the hall with his mother, both of them upright, both of them moving toward the stairwell. Davis confirmed into the radio that the third attacker was down. The building's 3 confirmed threats had now all been accounted for. Davis got Owen and his mother through the stairwell door. Mara got herself off the floor and followed. She made it to the second-floor landing before her legs stopped being entirely reliable. She sat on the stairs for a moment long enough for the worst of it to pass. Then she got up and kept going. Back at the security station, Pierce was waiting with a look on his face that had shifted considerably from its usual configuration. He didn't make the surgical argument again. He told her quietly that he needed to do something about the wound, or she was going to have significantly fewer options in the next hour than she had now, and he said it in a tone that was almost entirely without condescension. Mara told him local anesthetic only she needed to stay conscious. He nodded once and didn't argue. While Pierce worked, Cole came back with information that landed like something physical. One of the hospital's own security staff had been identified as a source. He had sold access information, internal maps, and Mara's shift schedule to an outside contact over the previous 2 weeks. That was how they had known which corridors had gaps. That was how they had known she would be here on this particular day. Claire had been awake for 20 minutes and had asked to speak to someone from Cole's team. Cole relayed what she'd said. She was a contract compliance analyst attached to a defense procurement office, and 10 days ago she had walked into a meeting she wasn't supposed to attend and come out of it with photographs on her phone she wasn't supposed to have. A senior procurement official accepting payment from a private defense contractor. And in the background of one image, almost incidental, standing near the doorway, a man she recognized from the Naval Intelligence Annex, where her brother's unit had once been briefed. Older now, but the same build, the same way of standing slightly apart from the group as if he were observing rather than participating. Mara heard this while Pierce closed the wound. With 7 stitches, she felt in full. She kept her face still the way she had learned to keep it still when something had to be processed but not yet shown. A man who stood apart, who observed, who knew everything about the people in the room without ever being the one they remembered afterward. She had worked alongside someone like that for 2 years. Someone who had sat in every pre-mission briefing and left no impression except competence and reliability. She filed the thought without speaking it. She needed to be wrong about this. She was not certain she was. Pierce finished. He set down the instruments and looked at his hands and then at her, and he said nothing about what he had watched her endure for the last 12 minutes without making a sound. The silence between them was different from the silence that morning. That one had been contempt moving in one direction. This one had no contempt in it at all. Talia had wrapped a strip of clean bandage around Mara's right palm, where the doorframe had opened the cut in the stairwell, and Owen had pressed his hand flat against it when she helped him toward the exit. A small, instinctive gesture of a child who had nothing else to give. The outline of it was still faintly visible in the fabric. The lights on Claire's floor went out at 6:43. Cole's radio erupted. A false distress signal had pulled 3 of his officers to the West Wing simultaneously. The 4th floor safe room had been opened from inside. Someone with a key card, someone who had been in position before the lockdown, sealed the building. The tunnel access under the loading dock level had been used before Cole's team reached it. By the time they breached the stairwell, the corridor was empty. Claire was gone. Cole went after them and hit the secondary charge that had been set at the base of the stairwell, a small device-shaped charge enough to bring him down hard against the wall and open a cut above his eye that bled extravagantly. His team pulled him back. The lower level was sealed. Claire was somewhere in the tunnel system beneath the building, and Meredith Vale was standing at the end of the hallway, telling anyone who would listen that she was transferring operational authority to the incoming federal response team, whose credentials Mara had not been able to verify, and whose arrival she was now certain was not the relief Meredith believed it to be. Mara's phone received an audio file from Claire's number. The voice on it was male, calm, and precise. It named the loading dock. It said one person only. It said if anyone else came through that door, they would hear the shot before they found her. Mara stood in the middle of the corridor with a redressed shoulder wound, no security access, no backup, and a hospital administrator actively working against her. Cole was sitting against the wall 12 feet away with a field dressing over his eye and the specific look of someone who knew they couldn't move fast enough to do what needed doing. The building was compromised. The people who had planned this had planned for almost everything. She looked down at her right hand. The bandage wrapped across her palm had Owen's small handprint pressed into it from when he'd grabbed her in the common room and held on with everything he had. She thought about what she had told him. The only thing bravery ever was. She pulled the radio off the wall mount. She looked at Cole. He looked back at her and gave a single that communicated without any room for misinterpretation, that he trusted her completely and was furious that he couldn't come with her. Mara turned toward the stairwell and went down. The loading dock level smelled of diesel and cold concrete, and the particular staleness of a space that existed entirely for function and nothing else. Mara came through the tunnel access at the far end and let her eyes adjust before she moved. The emergency lighting down here was a single strip of red along the baseboard, enough to see shapes, not enough to read faces. She moved along the wall with her right hand, trailing the surface, and her left arm held still against her ribs, counting the distance to the main bay the way she had counted distances in places that were much darker and much louder than this. The loading bay opened up ahead of her, a wide, high-ceilinged space with 2 freight elevators on the far wall, a row of medical supply shelves along the right side, and a transport vehicle parked near the center with its rear doors facing her. The vehicle's interior light was on. Through the back window, she could see Claire sitting upright, with her wrists bound to the safety rail, still in her hospital gown, her face composed in the deliberate way of someone who is frightened and has decided not to show it. Mara recognized that expression. She had worn it herself for 3 months in a place with much better lighting. A man stepped out from behind the left freight elevator and crossed the bay toward her, and Mara recognized him in the same moment that her stomach dropped through the floor. His name was Warren Briggs. She had known as an intelligence liaison, the man who coordinated communication between her unit and the naval command structure, who had sat in on every pre-mission briefing, who had known their routes and their timing, and every operational detail there was to know. He was the man who stood apart from the group while everyone else leaned over the maps. The man who observed. She had trusted him the way you trusted the architecture of a building, not because you examined it, but because it held you up and you stopped noticing it was there. He stopped 10 feet from her and looked at her with something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite regret, a kind of professional acknowledgement, as though she were a problem. He had always known he'd eventually have to solve in person. He told her she had been harder to find than expected. He said it almost appreciatively. Then he told her about Atlas. He laid it out the way someone does when they've decided honesty is cheaper than pretense, because she was here alone, because the building was controlled, because he had already calculated that this ended one way regardless. The mission that killed Atlas had not gone wrong. It had been directed wrong from inside the same command structure they had all served. Atlas had found the edge of the procurement network, a contractor relationship that had been laundering funds through defense supply chains for years, with senior officials on both the military and civilian side taking their cut. Briggs had been one of the architects of it. When Atlas started asking questions that were too specific to be coincidental, the decision was made to redirect the unit into a situation from which they were not expected to return. Claire's photograph had nearly surfaced the same network a decade later, which was why she had to be removed. And Mara had survived the original mission, which made her a loose end that had simply been waiting for the wrong moment to become a problem. Her file had been erased not as a protection, Briggs said. It had been erased so that if she ever surfaced and started asking questions, there would be no record to verify her claims against. Mara stood in the red-lit dark and absorbed this. She had spent years carrying the weight of a night when she had done everything right, and a man had died anyway, convinced at the deepest level that the failure was hers, that she had not been fast enough, skilled enough, present enough. That weight had shaped everything that came after it, the decision to disappear, the oversized scrubs, the deliberate shrinking, the 3 months of being invisible in a building full of people who needed exactly the kind of help she was qualified to give. All of it had grown from a guilt that had been manufactured for her, had been installed like a mechanism to keep her from looking too closely at what had actually happened. Briggs offered her the exit. He said it clearly. Walk away from Claire, leave the hospital, go back to whatever version of disappeared she could still manage, and none of the rest of it needed to happen. He said it like a reasonable man making a reasonable offer, and maybe in his own accounting of things that was exactly what he believed he was doing. From inside the transport vehicle, Claire's voice came through the gap in the rear window. She said she wasn't going to let Mara trade herself for her. She said Mara had taken a bullet for a stranger that morning, without a second of hesitation, and she was not going to sit there and let that be the price of her survival. Her voice was steady in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of fear. It was the same deliberate steadiness Mara had recognized in her face earlier. Then Claire shifted her bound wrists and pressed something against the underside of the safety rail, the small locator device Cole had pressed into her hand before leaving her room. And Mara saw the faint blue pulse of its activation light blink on. Claire had kept it hidden through everything, and she had just turned it on. Mara looked at Briggs and told him she was going to take his offer. She said it with the flat affect of exhaustion. Let her right shoulder drop slightly. Let the overall picture of her read as a woman who had nothing left to spend. She took 2 steps toward him, letting him reorient his attention toward her movement. And when she was close enough, she drove her right elbow into the side of his neck and grabbed his weapon arm before he could bring it level. What followed was not elegant. She had one working arm, 7 stitches in her shoulder that were not going to survive the next 90 seconds, and she was operating on whatever was left after a day that had started at 6 in the morning and included 1 gunshot wound and 4 flights of stairs. Briggs was larger and had 2 functional arms and the considerable advantage of not being injured. But Mara had spent years learning how to be effective in spaces and conditions that offered her nothing, and she knew this building. The way she had learned to know every building she'd spent time in the spray suppression system overhead, the freight elevator controls on the wall, the hydraulic lift mechanism on the loading dock door, the wheeled medical transport carts lined along the shelving unit to her right. She used all of it. She triggered the suppression system to release a burst of cold vapor that cut visibility in the bay for 15 seconds. She used those 15 seconds to put 2 heavy shelving units between herself and the second shooter who had come in from the tunnel behind her. She used the freight elevator call button to draw that shooter's attention to the wrong side of the bay. She could not win a sustained fight, and she knew it. What she could do was keep it chaotic enough that no one could get a clean shot at Claire, and she could do that for as long as she needed to. When the second shooter finally got an angle on Claire through the vehicle window, Mara was already moving. She stepped into the line of fire the same way she had stepped into it that morning in the emergency bay, not because she had decided to, but because her body had been trained to do exactly this, and no amount of 3 years and oversized scrubs had changed what was underneath. The shot went wide. Claire had thrown herself sideways in the same instant, wrenching the safety rail hard enough to pull one bracket free, and the bullet hit the interior panel instead of either of them. Cole's team came through the dock entrance 11 seconds later. They came in fast, and they came in with enough of them that it was over quickly. The second shooter went down. Briggs was contained against the far wall with 2 officers holding him before he could make any decision about the remaining options. Davis, the same officer who had been on the pediatric floor with Mara, was first through the door and had Claire out of the vehicle and the restraints off her wrists in under a minute. Briggs looked at Mara across the bay with the expression of a man recalculating. Then he said it precisely the way she had known a man like him would say something in a moment like this, when the calculation had gone wrong and there was nothing left but the last available cruelty. Raven should have died with Atlas. Mara looked at him and said nothing. She didn't need to. The officers took him through the door, and he was gone and she was still standing. Cole crossed the bay to her. He had a fresh dressing over the cut above his eye and was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone working through a headache they weren't going to mention. He looked at her shoulder, at the way she was holding herself, at the general condition of a person who had taken a through-and-through gunshot wound approximately 6 hours ago and had spent those 6 hours refusing to stop. He put a hand briefly on her right shoulder, the uninjured one, and that was sufficient. Admiral Grant Halstead arrived at Tidewater within the hour. He was a large, contained man who moved through the hospital corridor with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to rooms that rearranged themselves around his presence, but who did not appear to require that rearrangement. He asked to speak with the nurse who had placed herself between his sister and a weapon twice in the same day. The meeting was private. Mara told him the truth, not all of it in that room, not in a single conversation, but enough. She told him who she had been and why she had disappeared, and what she had carried, and what she now knew about the night that had made her believe she needed to carry it. Grant listened with the full attention of a man who understood that what was being said to him mattered, and that his response to it mattered more. When she finished, he told her that failing to save one person did not erase every person she had kept alive before or since, and that the events of today alone were evidence he did not think she needed him to elaborate on. Dr. Pierce had been in the corridor outside for most of the preceding hour. When Mara came out, he was still there. He asked to speak with her in front of the staff, who remained on shift, not in an office, not in a private exchange, but in the nursing station where he had called her careless that morning. He stood in front of her and told the assembled staff that he had spent the day watching a person he had publicly dismissed as incompetent demonstrate a level of capability, judgment, and commitment that he could not have matched under those conditions on his best day. He said he had confused her silence with weakness and her restraint with inadequacy, and that both errors were his and entirely his. He said he was sorry directly and without qualification. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She told him that apologies were starting points, and she would be watching for the distance he covered from this one. Meredith Vale was escorted to a separate meeting with the hospital's legal counsel and 2 investigators from Naval Criminal Command. Her failure to follow lockdown protocol, her decision to obstruct Cole's security operation, and her unilateral move to transfer site authority to an unverified federal team were all now part of a formal record. She was not a criminal. She was a woman whose instinct toward self-preservation had nearly made her complicit in something much worse than she understood, and she would spend a considerable amount of time accounting for that. The insider, the security officer, who had sold Mara's schedule and the building's access information, was in custody before the night was out. Grant offered Mara the restoration of her full military record and a commendation that reflected what the record had been stripped of. She declined the public portion. What she asked for instead was a working group Cole Pierce and whoever in hospital administration still had functional judgment to design and implement an emergency response protocol for armed incidents and mass casualty events. She wanted the staff trained. She wanted no one in this building to ever stand still in a crisis, because they had never been given the tools to do otherwise. Grant agreed to it before she finished the sentence. Pierce said he would like to be the first to go through the training. He said it without irony, and Mara believed him. Claire found her the next morning, before discharge, dressed in her own clothes, for the first time since the convoy, looking tired in a way that sleep would eventually fix. She asked the question directly, why had Mara stepped in front of a weapon for a stranger? Mara told her the truth, that in that moment Claire had not been an admiral's sister or a witness or a case. She had been a person who was afraid and who needed someone to be present with her, and Mara had been the person who was there. Claire took her hand, the right one, careful of the bandaging, and held it for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "Don't be afraid. I'm here." She said it back to Mara like returning something that belonged to her. Talia brought coffee at the end of the shift and stood beside Mara at the nursing station, without requiring anything from her, the way she always had. Owen's drawing arrived by the hand of his mother, who had apparently made a special trip, a crayon rendering of a nurse standing in front of a large, round object that was presumably a bullet, with uneven block letters beneath it, reading "The bravest person in the hospital." Mara looked at it for a long time. Cole found her in the corridor near the end of the day. He said he had spent the morning thinking about what he'd noticed 3 months ago, that she was someone worth paying attention to, and how badly he had underestimated even that. He asked if she wanted to get coffee. Not a debrief, not a follow-up. Just coffee between two people who had come through a very long day and were both still upright at the end of it. Mara said yes. She walked back through the Tidewater corridor, in the same plain scrubs she always wore, speaking to patients in the same low, even voice, occupying no more space than the work required. But she had stopped pulling her shoulders inward. Her eyes moved through the hallway at eye level. The tattoo that wrapped her left forearm, a compass rose dark ink, gone slightly soft at the edges. With time was no longer hidden under a sleeve she had tugged deliberately down every morning for 3 months. She had come here to get small enough that the past couldn't find her. What she understood now was that the past had never been the thing chasing her. She had been. And she was finished running from a guilt that someone else had built and handed to her, finished making herself invisible to protect a version of safety that had never been real. She was still Mara Ellison. She had always been Raven underneath. For the first time in a very long time, she did not need to choose between them. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply stay present, stay honest, and refuse to disappear even when disappearing feels easier. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, there are more stories like this one waiting for you, and we'd love for you to be here for them.